Hello and welcome back to Rockanory. It's been a while since I put a reading up because I'm having my computer fixed, but for some reason I think there might be a bit of a buzzing sound and a siren sound on this computer, so on this particular recording. So I hope it doesn't bother you too much or distract from the reading. But to make up for that, I'm going to read from one of my favourite books, and it's John Peel's Margrave of the Marshes, which came out on Bantam Press a few years ago, and it's you know, just dipping into it again has inspired me to kind of read it all over again because it's just so great. And I'm going to read a bit from part 2, which was of course written by John's wife Sheila, and she's a very funny writer and it's very interesting and insightful. So just going to read a bit from the very beginning of part 2 where Sheila is describing how they first met. To refer to the circumstances in which I first met John as auspicious, or even mildly promising, would be misleading, to say the least. It was November 1968, and I was at college in South London, studying to be a chemistry teacher. One of my friends occasionally acquired, through her lecturer, tickets for recordings of television shows. I hadn't been to one before, but I'd recently split up with a boyfriend and found myself at a loose end one Friday night. So I trundled off with her to the Riverside Studios in Hammersmith to watch the recording of a show called How It Is. One advantage of attending these shows was that you got paid, nothing grand, no repeat fees or anything like that, but 10 shillings was doled out once you had signed a contract promising not to leave before the programme was finished, and it paid for a few beers after the show. Of course, the downside was that you had to stay put no matter what, no matter how soul-crushingly tedious the show would become. The guests on this show, bizarrely, included the romantic author Barbara Cartland and the Liverpool group The Spinners, so staying in my seat may have represented the hardest 10 shillings I ever earned. To add to the general all-round fun and hilarity, there was a section in the programme where John, Ronald Fletcher and Richard Neville of Oz magazine would sit on stools discussing current events and delivering what press releases like to call a satirical look at the past week. I was familiar with John's radio show Top Gear, which I used to listen to on Sunday afternoons. I wasn't the full-on card-carrying hippie that he evidently was. I just liked some of the music. John was, don't forget, the man who was immortalised in Sood's Corner in Private Eye for writing that the music of Pink Floyd evoked the sound of dying galaxies. He always said he was proud of that, but he was sure he'd pinched the line from someone else. He didn't go in much for velvet, though he owned a caftan bought for an outrageous price from a shop off Carnaby Street. His suspicion that it had been a bedspread in a previous existence was one of the reasons why he could never wear it with the necessary conviction. Consequently, it didn't last long in his repertoire, for which swinging London should be eternally grateful. But wherever there was the smell of burning incense, or a gathering of hairy types in roomy velvet pantaloons, and that was just the girls, you'd find John. He was there, for instance, at the 24-hour Technicolor Dream at London's Alexandra Palace in the summer of 1967, explaining to suggestible young women that he was the far-out DJ who did that perfumed garden programme on Radio London, and that if they played their cards right, they could accompany him to the next exploding peppermint slipper happening. However, the women in question inevitably turned out to be less suggestible than they had first appeared, and the line notched up an impressive 100% failure rate. The fact that John prepared for How It Is by walking past the queue outside with Richard Neville, inspecting the incoming audience for comely young females who might possibly be more suggestible than those sceptics at Alexandra Palace, indicates that the sophistication of his pick-up techniques had not increased noticeably in the years since the 24-hour Technicolor Dream. John had a gig to do straight after How It Is, so he scurried off before the recording was finished, but I can't say I even noticed. But as my friends and I were getting up to leave and collect our 10 shillings, Ronald Fletcher approached me in a very gentlemanly manner and handed me a note. It said, "Would you call WEL 5847 on Saturday morning, about 11:30? Below that was the word peace. There was no name, so at first I thought it was all very mysterious. Then when the penny dropped, I thought, well, what do I do now? I went back to my digs in Putney and talked it over with my flatmate Terry, who encouraged me to call. At this point I had no intention of doing any such thing. I must have been a little bit excited though, because that night I phoned home and spoke to my sisters, whose sage and considered advice was, do it, do it! Throwing reason, good sense, and an innate suspicion of hippies to the wind, I ended up calling John the next morning. He asked me if I'd like to go to the cinema that evening, to see 2001, The Space Odyssey, which had just opened. At that point, the conventional notion of a date started to fade. First, he said he'd pick me up at 5 o'clock once he'd heard the football results. I didn't mind about the football part because I was a football fan as well, but I did think it was a strange time of day to go on a date. Who goes out at 5? It wasn't what you'd call rock and roll, but then John was full of little surprises. Despite being a hippie, he turned his nose up at dope. He smoked it occasionally in his peace and love days, as he enjoyed reminding the children whenever the subject of drugs came up at home. But he became more partial to marijuana in his 60s than he had been in the 60s, occasionally partaking of the odd monster joint at special occasions like festivals. So with John keeping his body as a temple, beer was off the menu for our first night together. He rolled up at 5, as promised, in his tatty Bedford dormobile, and off we went. As soon as we pulled away, he said he had something to tell me. I haven't been feeling very well for a few days, he mumbled, and I hope you don't mind, but I've got a doctor's appointment before we go out. It was certainly shaping up to be a hell of a date. 5 o'clock pickup, no alcohol, a detour to the doctor. It would have been consistent with the pattern so far if John had been diagnosed with leprosy. We went to the surgery in Fulham and I sat in the waiting room. John came out eventually and said, rather forlornly, "I've got to go straight to bed. I've got yellow jaundice." It's funny now to think I missed it, but he did look, well, there's no other word for it, yellow. I said, "Well, you better take me home then." But he pleaded with me to come back to his flat with him. "Don't go," he said. "I feel really sorry for myself. Please come back with me." And I did. He lived at Park Square Mews near Regent's Park, and his home was something to behold. It was very groovy, and I say that as someone who loathes the word groovy. There's simply no adequate alternative. Joss sticks were burning in every corner. And to complete the picture, John's flatmate was an androgynous photographer called Beautiful Peter, whose gorgeous blonde girlfriend was always sashaying around the place. It was such a different culture from the one I was used to. My friends, Jerry and Terry, were like me. One was from Halifax, the other from Barnsley, while I was from Shipley near Bradford. Not that John thought hippies were better than anyone else. He always maintained that dropping out was an essentially middle-class affair, a luxury not available to working-class people or anyone for whom money was scarce. From my experience of the hippies that we mixed with in the 60s, I agree. They certainly felt like some kind of elite to me, and I always suspected that I wasn't quite up to their level. I was intrigued by them, but never entirely comfortable with them. I'd stepped out of my digs that night, anticipating an evening of being wooed, if not wined, and barely an hour later I found myself in a scented hideaway, tending to a DJ with yellow jaundice. It wasn't the most conventional start to a romance, but it was a nice evening. We talked a lot, and listened to records. He was incredibly gentle and kind, which appealed to me, and very handsome. I was attracted to him from the start. Perhaps we became close more quickly than we might otherwise have done, because there was so much tenderness involved simply in me playing nursemaid to John. Not that yellow jaundice dampened his ardour. Whatever the symptoms, diminished libido didn't appear to be one of them. Incredibly, John clambered out of bed the next morning, giving off this glowing yellow aura, from the jaundice rather than any kind of innate divinity streaming from his pores, and made it over to Radio 1 to do his Sunday afternoon programme, Top Gear. I was shocked that he was going to do it despite being told to stay in bed, but it was an attitude I got used to over the 36 years we were together. John was one for soldiering on, even in the face of medical advice, common sense, earthquakes. He was unstoppable. That never changed. When he had kidney stones and was in so much pain he was unable to drive, I took him into London from Suffolk to do his show and drove him back again. The BBC would have been perfectly able to find someone to fill in, but John didn't want that. He had to do the show. Similarly, there were those evenings during his years of broadcasting from his studio at home when I could see that all he needed was to get some sleep. I'd give him a meal, dust him down, and he'd go in and do the programme, and invariably do it better than ever because he was trying that much harder. There were occasions when even he had to concede that the show didn't have to go on, and that work was beyond his limits, such as when he was admitted to hospital in 2001, after it was discovered he was diabetic. But even then it was necessary to keep him under armed guard in his hospital room, with the windows monitored from the rooftop by snipers in case he should try to make it to London on the milk train to do his show, although the snipers had been asked to aim below the knee, if possible. Well, I'm running out of time, but I hope you enjoyed that. It was a reading course from John Peel's Margrave of the Marshes, and link below if you want to find that book online. And in the meantime, have a fantastic week, and I will see you next week with another Rockanory reading for your delectation and delight. Until then.